Hello everybody, welcome to this afternoon's Speakers for Schools virtual talk. We're delighted you've been able to join us today. This session will last around 45 minutes and will include a presentation from our speaker before moving to student Q&A. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A function on the right hand side of your screen, and this will be open throughout the speaker's presentation. Unfortunately, we will not be able to answer all submitted questions. There is simply not enough time to answer them all, but rest assured they have been received by our team. We're absolutely ecstatic to welcome Sara Crofts, Chief Executive with the Institute of Conservation today. Sara has kindly agreed to join us this afternoon to discuss all of the work involved in conservation and hopefully give you some really interesting insights into potential future careers. Sara, hi, welcome to your first Speakers for Schools virtual talk. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
Fantastic. So I think you have an excellent presentation to get us started, and then in the meantime, I'll be getting some wonderful student questions for you.
Excellent. Okay, in that case, I will crack on. So hi, everyone. As you heard, my name's Sara Crofts, and I am the Chief Executive of a thing called the Institute of Conservation, or ICON for short. I thought I might just say a word about what ICON is to start with and what I'm going to talk about today. So what we are is the professional membership body for people who do conservation. And we've got about 2,500 members in the organisation. We look after them, but we also champion conservation as a profession. And we try to help people get interested in conservation and perhaps to consider a career in our world. We're also a charity, which is a little bit unusual. And that means that we spend some of our time promoting the importance of looking after the treasured things that we've saved from the past. But we're not a very big organisation, so there's actually only 10 of us on the staff team. But we do have a huge and very wonderful group of volunteers. So I thought I'll start by telling you a little bit about me and my background and how I got into this career. So I grew up in Ayrshire in southwest Scotland. You might pick up a bit of a Scottish twang in my accent. And I have absolutely adored old buildings ever since I was a kid. So that's why I chose this image to kind of illustrate that. So what you have there is my passion for old buildings and my new passion, which is cycling. So that's who I am. I'm an architect, loves old buildings, and also riding bicycles. And sometimes, if I'm lucky, I can get the two things to come together. So how did I get to where I am today? Well, I studied in Scotland, so that means that instead of GCSEs and A-levels, I did standard grades and then higher. And when I chose my standard grade a long time ago, I really had no strong ideas about what I wanted to do. So I picked a mix of things that I liked, and that was everything from Latin, would you believe, at one end of the spectrum to computing studies, completely at the other. But it turned out to be quite a sensible plan, because that mix of a bit of arts and a bit of science has been quite a strong basis for a career working in conservation. But it wasn't until I got to, I think, my last year in school when I realised that it would actually be possible to have a job working with the buildings that I spent a lot of my free time looking at. So I applied to study architecture, and I went to university in Edinburgh for 5 years. And at the end of that, I specialised in conservation of old buildings rather than in designing new things, because that was what really got me excited. And I thought I'd share this photograph or this image with you all, because it makes me smile that this image, which is from the Middle Ages, so from about 1500, and it shows the stonemason's yard around a cathedral which would have been being built at that time. And why I like it is because that actually, if you were to visit a stonemason's yard at a cathedral today, you'd see essentially the same things. You'd see the same tools, the same types of people. And perhaps my favourite thing about this image is that the person in charge appears to be the woman in the middle. So I think that tells us that gender equality perhaps isn't necessarily always a new thing. So what did I do? I left university and I did work for a little while as an architect, but then I took a bit of a change of direction and I undertook a scholarship with the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, or SFAB as it's sometimes known. And that led to a series of different roles, but all within the world of heritage. I spent 5 years of my time there running a training programme, and that was aimed at teaching people how to care for their old buildings. And that's me looking a lot younger in the image on the bottom left. And what was nice about working for the SPAB was that it threw up a whole series of opportunities. So one nice bit of work that I got involved in was some trips over a number of years to Jamaica, where we got involved in helping people there think about how to look after their historic buildings. And that's what you see on the bottom right of the slide, a rather derelict old building that we were trying to figure out how it could be repaired and reused. After a spell at SPAB, I then went on to work for the Heritage Lottery Fund, the very grand title of Head of Historic Environment. But essentially what I was doing there was trying to help the people who make decisions about funding to know where best to spend that money. Where could they make the most difference? What things should they help? And one of the really lovely parts about that job was simply being able to interact with people and to see interesting places and wonderful objects. And the gold torque, a type of necklace that you see on the top right slide, was one of the things I was very privileged to get up close to. And sometimes we did some fun stuff as well. So occasionally there was an opportunity to take part in a live debate or be on television. And the last image on the slide is one of the last things I did actually before lockdown, which was to take part in a debate. So that brings me to not quite the present day, but certainly to the Institute for Conservation, ICON. I joined ICON last January as the Chief Executive, and I did that because I wanted to get back to working in the voluntary sector, because charities are really what I care about. I like being part of a small organisation where you can make decisions quickly, you can get stuff done, and you can actually make a real impact. Plus the fact that everyone we work with in the charity really cares passionately about what we do. We all do it because we believe in conservation and in heritage. And this image is one of the very first things I had to do as the new Chief Executive, which was to open our major international conference in Belfast last June. I'm happy to say that I've now been there for 1.5 years, and so far, so good. So on to what I hope you're tuning in to hear about, which is a little bit about what conservation is and about what working in the sector might be like. So let's talk about conservation. And let's start with the question, what is heritage? See, heritage is a funny word. People talk about heritage in all sorts of contexts. They talk about heritage apples, which are maybe old varieties of apples. Perhaps you've heard people talking about going to buy some heritage paint for their new house, in which case they probably just mean that it's the colours that you might expect to see in a BBC costume drama. But what is it really? Well, heritage is almost anything that you want it to be. It certainly doesn't have to be the stuff in a museum, and it doesn't have to be valuable either. It doesn't even have to be something that you can touch. So it can be traditions, it can be recipes, it can be dance, it can be people's histories, all sorts of things. So heritage is really just something from the past that matters to people today. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and maybe you might have some questions about that to ask me later. So what is conservation then? Well, if heritage is the stuff, if you like, conservation is the way that we look after it. So it's a way of approaching the objects, the items, and preserving them so that people can use them, can enjoy them, and also can learn from them. And there's lots of different elements that make up conservation. So the processes might include investigating the object, documenting it, so writing about what condition it's in and what it is, cleaning it perhaps, and sometimes also repairing it. And what I like about conservation is that we care about the whole history of the object. So we're concerned about not just what it was originally and trying to make it look as good as new, but about the story of its life. So for example, if great Aunt Gertrude drops the brass candlestick on the floor and it gets a big dent in it, well, a conservator wouldn't necessarily want to fix the dent because that's become part of the story. And the story might be about what made great Aunt Gertrude cross in the first place. So often when conservators work on the objects, you can't actually see what they've done. But the things that they have done will make sure that the objects survive for future generations to enjoy. I thought I might just show you a little video that gives you a little flavour of some of the kinds of work that my colleagues do. Well, I don't know about you, but that certainly makes my heart race when I see that video. Just the idea of being so up close with such an important object that has an amazing history to it. It's one of the things that I think draws people to work in this area. So if that's what conservation is, we might mention what conservation isn't. And I suspect that you might have seen this particular set of images. They're from a couple of years ago now, but they're an example of where conservation went wrong. So this particular fresco is in a church in Spain, and a local person volunteered to restore it. But they maybe didn't have quite the best artistic skills, and so the end result wasn't entirely successful, shall we say, and it was a bit of a media phenomenon at the time. Ironically, the church now gets more visitors than it did before, but perhaps for the wrong reasons. So members of ICON would be horrified, I think, if people thought that this was the sort of thing they did. Back to proper conservation. Conservators work on a huge range of different types of objects, and I'll show you a few more as we work through some slides. But it really is everything from textiles to paintings, stained glass, statues, metalwork, furniture, ceramics, archaeology, The list goes on and on. But one of the biggest specialisms is probably books and paper. And that makes sense if you think about the vast collections of books in the British Library, in the libraries in the towns where you live as well. But there are others too, and this is an example of textile conservation. This particular dress is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it was specially made for Queen Elizabeth II, the present Queen. So textile conservation, sometimes it's about royal dresses, but it's also sometimes military uniforms, tapestries, and even modern fashions. So in the same room as this wonderful jewel encrusted dress, there were also trainers and other bits of modern fashion being considered as well. And I did promise you all that I would mention Big Ben, because conservators also get involved in working things. So they look after clocks, they look after trains, and indeed they look after ships. And the image on the left is Embarked Kingdom Brunel's SS Great Britain in Bristol. And there's a real challenge with these kind of objects, not just because they're big, but because they are working objects. So they have moving parts. They still need to do the job that they were designed to do. It's not like putting something in a museum where it's safe and it doesn't have to be operated. So there's a real special skill, and that means that some of our members are actually engineers or mechanics or have those different types of backgrounds. And one of the other types of conservator who you may not think about are what we call preventative conservators. And these are the people who get very, very excited about pests. When we have objects in collections, in country houses, in churches, they are at risk of being eaten by beetles and moths and other sorts of bugs. So preventative conservators are there to monitor, trap, and sometimes destroy all the little beasties. But they also do things like monitoring light levels and making sure that the objects don't get damaged in the first place. But regardless of the type of object that conservators work on, and indeed how damaged it is, the thing that is in common is the fact that conservation is all about problem solving. And I think that's what draws a lot of our members to do the job, apart from their love of heritage. They like the puzzle, they like the challenge. So when faced with a broken vase like this one, they enjoy working out whether they have all the pieces. How do the pieces go back together? What glue are they going to use? Where are they going to start? What happens if there's a bit missing? So that's a core skill that underlies a lot of what we do. One of the other things that's very important to conservators is an ability to focus in on detail, to really get interested in tiny, tiny things and working very, very carefully at a very small scale. So they tend to be very methodical and they take huge care. And this is a little time-lapse video of some paper conservation being carried out. So as you can see, the conservator is painstakingly unfolding all the little bits where the paper has become wrinkled, smoothing out the page, using weights to help to flatten it down. And eventually, once all the pages are smoothed out again, she'll be able to put the book back together. So you need a bit of patience to be a conservator. You also need to have a little bit of an interest in science. So quite a lot of the work that conservators do actually is carried out in a laboratory, and they use various types of equipment. They use X-ray, they use colour imaging, they use chemicals in vast quantities as part of the process of identifying what's wrong with the objects and figuring out how to put them back. So often A conservator studio will look more like a laboratory, a little bit like this example here. And this is another example of a piece of work being carried out. This is a little gold bowl with enamel that was part of the Staffordshire hoard. And I'll let you watch an archaeological conservator, in this case, doing her work. And what she's doing there is using a scalpel to very, very gently scrape the mud off the surface of the vessel. So on the right-hand side, you can see where she's already been working, where you can see the beautiful jeweled colours of the enamel, the green and the red. And the left-hand side is the part that she's still to complete. So you can see the dusty orange, the mud, the crust of the mud, basically because it came out of the ground where it had been for several hundred years before it was found a few years ago. And they're just two of many examples. I thought perhaps you might also like to see a little bit of a variety in terms of where conservators work. So sometimes they work on building sites. They might be looking after the stonework or the statues, or they might be looking after the stained glass. This particular photograph is taken inside the dome of a very large church. And you can see that the conservator here is actually using a rope access system to get to where they need to work. So there are scope for some rather more adventurous and exotic skills and specialisms within conservation. Needless to say, if you work on building sites, you probably need a bit of a head for height. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but I certainly recommend it. Conservators also work on World Heritage sites. This is the Iron Bridge in Shropshire. Now, the Iron Bridge is famous and is a World Heritage site because it's the first ever cast iron bridge in the whole world. So it's a very special place and was opened in 1781. So as you can imagine, 2 or 3 years ago, it was in a bit of a sorry state. It needed quite a lot of repairs, and there was quite a major project to carry out those repairs. And that's what you see in this image here, is fixing the broken bits of the cast iron and repainting it. And one of the things that they learned during the project was that actually the colour that it was painted at the start wasn't the original colour, and that it should have been this rather nice dark red. So it's now been restored in the sense of putting it back to being the original red. Quite fun. And some conservators work in their own studios, so they may work on their own, or they may work with 1 or 2 others, but essentially they have private clients, so they may take pieces from museums, but sometimes they're working on simply treasured possessions that belong to families or individuals. An old photograph maybe, an old Bible, family Bible perhaps, or an old shawl or a dress that belongs to a family member. So every end of the spectrum really. And I think I did also promise dinosaurs. And so here we have the Natural History Museum, because a lot of conservators do indeed work in museum settings. And in this museum, the conservators will look after not just the dinosaurs, but also the other animals, the insects, the fossils, and everything in between. So as I said, it's a huge spectrum of different interests and different specialisms. There's no dull moments in conservation, I promise you. So some of this has started to catch your imagination, and you're starting to think, that sounds quite interesting. What is it that you might want to think about studying? Well, a bit like me, from my architectural background, a little bit of arts, a little bit of science, and a little bit of history is a pretty good start. But I'm going to confess that although I spend all my time now thinking about history and heritage, I didn't like history at school. I didn't enjoy it at all. So I've come around to it as I've got older. But really, I would say that the key thing is curiosity. Curiosity and an interest in the past are what really matters. That passion. And there's lots of ways that you can think about getting into conservation as a career. There are some undergraduate courses at universities, but that's by no manner of means the only route. Interestingly, where it is taught at university, it's quite often taught in the same places as fine arts or perhaps craft skills, partly because conservation, although there are elements of theory and it's quite a formal process in terms of documentation, there's actually a lot of hand skills involved, so a lot of working with tools at close range. So it's quite allied to arts and crafts in that sense. And we're fortunate that there are often bursaries to help people study conservation, and there are also often internships so that people can get practice working in a studio, either in a museum or in an institution or a gallery, or for organisations like the National Trust or English Heritage, because it's very important that people do get practical experience. You have to learn conservation by doing. And the new-ish but exciting development is actually around apprenticeships. Hopefully these will be available within the next year, and there will be two levels, conservator, which is what I've been talking about, or technicians, who are the people who support conservators. If you think you'd like to learn a little bit more about what being a conservator might be, one top tip that came from some of my members was to suggest that you look when the museums are open again, as they're not at the moment, unfortunately, but when they open again, if they run behind the scenes tours where you can get to visit the conservator studios and see what happens to fix the objects. A little bit like there was a programme on television quite recently which was Secrets of the V&A, which showed you behind the scenes. It is possible to go and visit the studios and to talk to conservators and see what they do in practice. That might be something that would be worth doing. But I think that's probably about enough for me for the moment. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to let you ask me some questions, I think.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sara. We've had a lot of questions submitted from our students.
Wow.
So to get us started, we'll just kind of ask a few questions from our students about your own career and your own journey, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. So one of our students has asked, who or what has inspired you throughout your career?
It varies at different times. But the person who always comes back into my mind first is a Victorian woman who had the same name as me. She was a Sara Losh, and she was probably one of the first female architects, though she wouldn't have called herself that at the time. But she built, or rather she commissioned and designed, a church in Cumbria. And it's fabulous because it's completely mad. It doesn't follow any patterns or any rule books of the time. So it's about 130 years old now. And it's full of the most bizarre carvings of animals and birds and pine cones. And it's just brilliant because it's a little bit crazy and a little bit fun. But she was doing that at a time when no one would have dreamt that women would be architects. So she's a bit of a role model, I think.
That's great. Thank you so much. Another questions from our students here. Beatrice has asked, what was the reason behind the move from architecture to conservation?
I didn't probably move straight from, well, I set off to be an architect, but I always knew I wanted to work on old buildings. And so I picked a course that I knew would let me specialise in historic buildings at the end of it. And when I finished, my plan was to be an architect, and that was what I would be for forever. But that was at time of foot and mouth disease, which was around 2000, and there was a bit of a recession. So I went back into training and undertook the SPAB scholarship. And purely coincidentally, really, at the end of that, the SPAB had a job that they were looking for someone to do casework for them, so to look at what other people were proposing for buildings and to comment on whether it was good or bad. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I'll give that a shot. And I did, and I stayed with SPAB for 10 years, albeit I changed roles a few times within that. And I'm going to admit that I am probably not the world's best architect, but I do know how to fix buildings. I know how to help other people fix buildings, and realised that that was probably where I could be more useful.
Fantastic, thank you. Another couple of questions from our students, Holly and Ashak here, looking at the different challenges you might have faced in your career. So I guess, are there challenges that you have faced, and would you say resilience has played a role in your career and journey?
Oh, challenges. Yes, the first big challenge I hit was when I was fairly new out of university. I was in my first year of being in practice. And if you're an architect, in order to be able to call yourself an architect, you have to sit professional practice exams, and you have to be in an office to do that. And I think I was about 3 months away from the date of my professional practice exam when the company I was working for went bust, and I found myself out of a job. So I very quickly had to look around the local area and to find someone to take me on, simply so that I could sit my exams. And it was a challenging time. It felt the clock was ticking. But as with all these things, you get an energy, I think, out of having to face a challenge. And if you just focus and you convince yourself that actually this is doable, there will be an answer, something will come along. And I had help from friends, I had support from family, and sure enough, along came a job, and I was able to sit my professional practice exam, and passed, even better.
Fantastic, that's great, thank you. One of our students here, Holly, has asked, why is Big Ben under construction?
I don't know, I shouldn't call a clock or a bell a he, but whether he is or not, I don't know. You've probably seen in the news that there's a huge project, possibly the biggest conservation project ever, which is happening around the Houses of Parliament at the moment. And that's basically because the Houses of Parliament are a Victorian building, and all buildings have a sort of lifespan. All the materials, all the fittings, all the fixtures, they don't last forever, and it's got the point where it needs a lot of repair, and that includes things like Big Ben in the clock tower. So every so often we have to do these major projects, and it will be a big undertaking. It will also hopefully be a good training opportunity to bring people into conservation. But it's part and part of a cycle of repair. Unfortunately, a bit like people, nothing really lasts forever, and we have to invest in some construction projects from time to time.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think that links very nicely to a question that Grace has submitted here, which is, can anything be conserved forever, or will everything eventually fade?
Oh, the only thing that's absolutely certain is that everything will eventually crumble back to dust. It will take a long time, but yes, there is no material really, or no creation or thing that we've made that has an endless life. So conservation is actually properly defined as the management of change. So we accept that things change, and conservation tries to slow down the rate of change. So we know that we can't make things last forever, but by keeping the light levels low, by replacing worn parts, we can keep them going as long as possible. But sometimes we have to say goodbye to things, and things are let go in museums, taken out of the collections.
Thank you so much. We've had a lot of questions about the conservation of different items and how long it takes. So I guess I will delve into a few of these now. So one of our students has asked, how long does it take to conserve an item? I guess that does depend on, what that is, but is there an average amount of time, or what's the longest kind of conservation process you've ever seen?
The longest conservation process? Oh, crikey, that's a very, very good question, actually. And you're absolutely right that it varies hugely depending on what the object is. It makes me think of, it's sort of an old joke, but if people know the Forth Rail Bridge, the very iconic big red bridge that crosses the Forth just north of Edinburgh, the joke there used to be that you never ever finished repainting the Forth Rail Bridge, because as soon as you got to one end, you had to go back to the beginning and start over again. But that, interestingly, they found a new type of paint which they think will last 25 years. So you could say that's one measure. But yeah, it's small objects are probably relatively quick and might be conserved in a day or two. But there are other projects that last for years and may have several conservators working on them. It also depends a lot on how bad the condition of the object is. Sometimes they don't need a lot done, they maybe just need a light clean. But in other cases, it might be a case of repairing the backing structure or filling in missing gaps. And sometimes it depends on how urgent and how big a project people want to make it. So yeah, so that's the how long's a piece of string question. A very well conserved piece of string.
Absolutely. We've had a few questions here about different items that might be conserved. One of those is, has something like a medieval toilet ever been conserved?
Medieval toilets? Oh, even better than that, we've conserved Roman toilets. If people ever visited the Hadrian's Wall, one of the forts on Hadrian's Wall is quite famous for its latrines, its toilets. And therefore, actually, yes, toilets of all ages have been conserved. And I know this is only just after lunchtime, but I will tell you that conservators also conserve the material, in inverted commas, that you find in toilets. I'll let you fill in the details for yourself there.
One of our students here, Steph, has asked, are you taught to repair and conserve all different types of items or just one type? And are there different people?
Hello?
Hello?
Oh, you disappeared for a second.
Oh,
there.
Apologies. So Steph has asked, are you taught how to repair and conserve all of these different types of items and objects or just one type? And are different people needed to conserve different items?
Okay, oh, that's another really good question. Some things are common. So what happens is that most courses start with theory, principles of conservation, which are common to everything. And that an example is that one principle is, we describe it as minimal intervention. So the idea that you do as little as possible to stabilize an object. But then when it comes to actually learning the practical techniques, it does tend to separate out into different disciplines. So, for example, at London City and Guilds, the Art College, they have a course in furniture conservation, and they have a separate course in working on stone carving and masonry. There are other courses that are specific to books and paper or to textiles. Preventative conservation, it tends to be a bit of everything. So that's more of a generalist thing. So it can depend on what people get excited about and what area they want to work in. But actually, often projects are collaborative as well. A good example there are the medical collections that belong to some of the hospitals. So if you think of early forms of prosthetic limbs, which might be mixtures of wood and metal and plastic, that actually needs a team of conservators because it needs someone who knows about the wood and the metal and the plastic. So sometimes it is collaborative, which I think is quite a nice aspect.
Absolutely, that's great, thank you. One of our students as well has asked, have you ever seen a kind of a favourite project, I guess, or conservation project or item that's really excited you in your career?
Oh, I was going to say, I tend to get excited about the last thing that I saw because I get I'm just generally nosy, and I love seeing what people are working on. But I think one of my favourite projects is actually a very unremarkable church in the outskirts of Nottingham, which had been fairly badly treated in the 1970s and had a false ceiling put in. And the project that happened recently was they decided that they would quite like to take out the false ceiling and enjoy the full space of the church as it used to be. And they knew from stories in the community that there might be wall paintings, but no one was really sure about it. So as part of preparing for the project, a local electrician climbed up into the space above this false ceiling, and lo and behold, on the east wall, they could see the top half of two figures. The bottom half had been completely painted over, but they could see the top half. And through a big project, they were able to put that back to what it looked like originally. So they were able to clean and conserve the paintings from the top half, but they had to recreate the lower half. And that was a wonderful project, not just because of the conservation, but because it actually brought the community in that place back together again, because they thought their church wasn't special. They didn't think they had anything to get excited about. And then it turned out they did. And it is the most wonderful space now. So yeah, favourite project is a church project.
That's fantastic, thank you. A few of our students, I think, might now be interested in a career in conservation, which is very exciting. And one of our students was that, is there anything specific at GCSE perhaps that might be really helpful for students to consider studying?
I think it's as I said, that it's probably quite useful to have a mix. Certainly conservation will involve a bit of science, so a bit of chemistry is no bad thing. If they thought they might be interested in doing more of the preventative type of conservation, then a bit of biology, understanding the pests might be quite useful. But actually, a lot of the core skills are quite common. So we write a lot of reports. We need English for that. There is a bit of maths involved in thinking about making up chemicals and those sorts of things as well. So I would tend to go for a broad range. Balance between arts and science. But having said that, a lot of people come into conservation from lots of different places. So mostly the courses are interested in whether you care about heritage. It's the passion that's the real key thing.
That's wonderful, thank you. And one of our last couple of questions here. How long does it take to be an art or archaeological conservator?
Mostly people do an undergraduate degree, so that's 3 years, and then often people top that up with a postgraduate of a year, sometimes 2. So it's about 4 years of study at that level, and then perhaps a little bit of time spent doing internships. So it is a kind of lengthy process, but there tends to be a balance between being in university setting and being in a workplace, which is quite a nice way of sort of breaking it up a bit.
Absolutely. And finally, one last question. How important do you think heritage is to society?
Crikey, that's a big question for a last question. And and it's a really good question, because actually it's a question that I answer on not quite a daily basis, but quite close to it. Because as students will understand, we live in difficult times and we have to make the case for conservation. So it's partly about identity, about helping us understand who we are. And we need to understand the past to make good decisions about the future. But we know that if people spend time in heritage buildings, in museums, it's actually good for their mental health and well-being. So there's a really strong social aspect to it as well. If you think about the number of people who've engaged with culture in museums online while we've been in lockdown, they're doing that because it helps them feel better, and that's an important part of why heritage matters. And it's beautiful. I'm not sure if that's the most intellectual answer, but it's a good one as far as I'm concerned.
It absolutely is. Thank you so much for your time today, Sarah. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. But a huge thank you for joining us, and I think really shedding a light on the potential careers and the work of the conservation sector as well, something that I think our students have a lot of interest in based on their questions. So thank you for being with us and for sharing your insights and experiences today.
You're very welcome. Come and join us.
And just a quick announcement for students who have tuned in today. We have shared a feedback form on the Q&A thread. It would be much appreciated if you could complete that, please. And also announcement for today's colour, that is dark red, and you will only need that if you are completing the student activity sheet for your school or college. A huge thank you to everyone who tuned in this afternoon, and we hope to see you for future virtual events. Have a great day, everyone.